This is our last class, and I think it's a fitting book to end the class with. I'm so glad that David recommended that I read it. I've known about Jill Lepore for years, but I did not know about this book. And this, The Name of War, King Philip's War and the Origins of American Identity, was published in 1998. You see it won the Bancroft Prize. The Bancroft Prize, she is a full professor at Harvard now. Bancroft Prize is one of the most prestigious awards you can give to a historian, and it's specifically a prize that's awarded to people who write American history. And one of the remarkable things, there's so many remarkable things I think about this book, and one of them is that she won this award at the beginning of her academic career. Wow. She's somewhere about 3/4 of the way through it, I would imagine now, but she was an untenured professor at Boston University when she first wrote this book, and it won so many prizes. So let's start off with, I'm going to sort of do this backwards and come to the next slide, David, which is the conclusions that she presents us. And these are conclusions that we have already really covered in the class, but I just think it's helpful to review them in summary, because as we have seen, and particularly as today's presentation by Strong Turtle indicated, sometimes we're not exactly sure in the historical record what went on, but some of the general facts are not really in dispute, and the conclusions that we can draw from them are, first of all, the magnitude of the war. It was, in terms of loss of life, property, cruelty, one of the bloodiest, if not the bloodiest war in American history. The outbreak of the hostilities, in contrast to that early period where there was a peace treaty that was crafted by Osamequin with the original colonists. In contrast to that, diplomacy, trade, negotiation, and so on in that first generation, stands in stark contrast to all of that. King Philip's War represents, comes sort of towards the end of Lepore's argument. King Philip's War represents a turning point in which any hope of indigenous cultural and political autonomy is annihilated, essentially. And the British moved one step closer to providing a framework that would eventually lead, a century and a half later, to Indian removals under Andrew Jackson. And no treaty was signed, and the war never ended, really. Okay, so those are kind of the conclusions that I think all of what we have read, seen, heard, have led us to. Now, how does she get there? And one of the things I liked about Strong Turtle's presentation was he gives us the sense of what it is to be a historian on the ground. And we know, you've got to find evidence, and evidence, of course, in whatever records are left and so on. But there's often disputes about what those are, or they're contradicting deeds, for example. The historian's job is to sort through all of that. Next slide, please. Images of war. The title I put for this slide is a little bit ironic. It comes from the album some of you may know. It's a throwback to the 60s. Gil Scott-Heron, friend of mine from high school actually, who was singing and writing political songs about the Vietnam War, about the images that we were seeing every night on television. And Lepore starts off her book actually saying, this is a war without images, artistic images. Clearly when there was no television, but how do we learn about or understand what's happening in a war? And often we're used to doing it through images. This is the one surviving image, and it's from a map. All of the photographs, by the way, that are up here come from Lepore's book. So, and she gives the attribution when you read it. It's not really kosher, but we're an educational group. Okay, so this map was published in 1675, map of New England, and what do you see? Well, what we know about the way British conducted warfare in a line with the muskets that maybe didn't go off or they couldn't shoot straight or whatever, and the bows and arrows that were initially at least more effective. And then there's a lot of land and maybe some forestry over here, but that's kind of it. That's what we see about the war, and it doesn't tell us much. Next slide, please.
These images were published in England.
In England, yeah. So that's what they were eager to hear about what was happening to their relatives on the other side of the pond, as it were. So, and that's the image they got. Okay, people are shooting at each other. Where do we get our images, our sort of visceral understanding of what the war was and did. Where we get it from words. And she says one of the other remarkable things about this war was how much was written about it. It only lasted about a year and a half.
14 months.
14 months. Less than 14 months, a little over a year. Tons of writing, of course, from the British side. Hardly anything from the Algonquin side. In the archives, 400 letters or more, 30 published different accounts, dispatches from the front, basically, letters back home to people in England, diaries, chronicles, plays, epic poetry. All of this is trying to account for the war, and these accounts don't always align. They're not sometimes in dispute. The colonists declared victory at the end of the war, but most of them, and she finds this in some of the accounts, the people that are honest anyway, will acknowledge that if Philip had been better supplied and prepared and hadn't been fighting 3 enemies at a time, so he was fighting the British, he was fighting the allies of the British, the Pequot, the Mohegan, and some of the praying Christians, and the Mohawk to the west. If he hadn't been fighting on 3 fronts, they might not have won. And they knew that. In their heart of hearts, they knew that. So did they really win? She argues the written accounts try to establish the victory of the colonists. They win through writing about it. They win by controlling the narrative. And they also try to account for the justness of the war, the justness of their cause, and finally the expiation for some of the horrible things that they did during the war. Next slide, please. She doesn't use this phrase keyword, but the idea of a keyword comes from the theorist Raymond Williams. He said keywords are phrases or words that do heavy work. They condense a bunch of ideas, and sometimes conflicting ideas at once. When you encounter a keyword during a historical moment, you understand that this is of importance to people who are talking about this thing. And she says, basically, in not so many words, war is a key word. It means lots and lots of things. It communicates intensity. It establishes who's right and who's wrong. It's used to rally support and gain allies, document pain, and sometimes to alleviate pain. And if you think about what's going on in the world today and the nightly news that you might see about either the Middle East or about what's happening in the Sudan or the Ukraine, and you think about how, I'll give an example, Zelensky has addressed Congress, and what he's had to say about the war, the way he talks about it is justifying our support of him and why he needs more money and more arms and more this and that and the other thing. It's about the just right of the Ukrainian people. He's recruiting more allies in different places and so on. When reporting comes from Gaza Strip, there's documentation of pain, terrible pain. Same thing on the Israeli side. Okay, so words about war describe it, but sometimes they're lies. Or, let's say, they're based on innuendo, they're based on rumor, they're based on propaganda. You have to be really careful about the words you use about war, and they're slippery, because words about war try to create order out of chaos. And again, think about the nightly news you see about warfare in the contemporary world. You see people, supposedly in the field. What's happening there, on the ground? And the reporter has the fighting in the background and so on. And you see people being taken off in stretchers, and you see guns, and you see rubble and so on. It's a mess. War is a mess. Writing about war is a mess, and it tries to make order out of that mess. And the most important point here that she makes, and I think it's the whole point of her book, is that the way that we write about war prepares us and structures and organizes our memory of the war, how the war is remembered. And that's why it is so important to try to resurrect some of the side that's not written by the Algonquins, because the way the war is remembered is the dominant British version of it. Whether we call something a massacre, surprised, we're just defending ourselves now because we were being massacred, or whether we call it a genocide, we actually want to wipe you off the face of the earth, or whether we call it a rebellion, people who were attempting a coup against their own leaders. All of this structures how we remember it, how people go on with their
Or a
lives.
just cause.
Or whether it's a just
the
cause.
American Revolution.
Exactly. This structures how we remember it. Next slide. Okay. I love this juxtaposition of two images here that comes out of, it's found somewhere in the archives of, I think it comes from the Winthrop family. And the British encountering the indigenous people as they, first plundered their caches of grain and so on, and their burial sites around Cape Cod and Plymouth, and then actually meeting them and signing treaties and negotiating and so on. Weren't exactly sure where these indigenous people stood on the great chain of being leading up to, of course, European civilization. They hadn't really completely made up their mind, but they had a mandate, actually. They had a mandate. Part of their patent from the king was that they were going to be allowed to settle and establish a colony that would be, in tribute to England, but also they were supposed to be doing some good in the world, which was missionizing, saving the souls of these people. And if you assume that somebody has a soul worth saving, then they have to be partially human. So they have to save the souls, and they felt they had an advantage, and the main advantage was literacy. They called this the literal advantage, And here you have a picture on the left of Increase Mather, who was the preacher who so often wrote these, fiery tracts and so on in the Puritan community. He's pictured here seated in his study, surrounded by books and so on. Even his dress, his collar is a book, if you look at it closely. So he's pictured as a learned person surrounded by words. And it is in contrast to Nittigret, who was a sachem among the Niantic, and he's out in the wilderness. You see, the forest is behind him. He's wearing a buckskin breeches and a loincloth. Maybe he's got a draped cloth, but he's carrying a knife, and so on. And he is, solitary and by himself and out in the wilderness. Why? What is so important about literacy? This is, I think, very, very key to Lepore's argument. We have to remember that the colonists were Protestants. They were escaping, persecution in Europe, which led them to flee England for New Amsterdam, and eventually try to establish their own colonies in the New World. And in the Protestant Reformation, one of the key things was a focus on getting rid of intermediaries and establish dogma of the Catholic Church, and later the Anglican Church, High Anglican Church, and that humans had a direct relationship individually to God. And they established that relationship by reading the Bible, by scripture, by interpreting sacred texts. And so this was a heavy emphasis on individuals. It emphasized literacy and the power of the word. And it goes back to the idea in the early Greek versions of the Bible that are translated into English. The beginning in Genesis starts in Greek, enarhe, enho logos, kaiho logos, and prostantheon, which means in the beginning there was the Word, and the Word was God. So the Word in and of itself was sacred. They felt they possessed that. The Indians, the Algonquins, did not. Okay. That's why there's also an emphasis on teaching. Next slide. So, we have one of the interesting things about Lepore as a historian, from my perspective, because I'm not a historian, I'm an anthropologist, is that she uses a number of different frameworks or critical tools to try to make sense of these documents that were left behind that structure our understanding of what happened during the war. And she borrows heavily from philosophical schools. She borrows from anthropology as well. And of course, we have some of the written records, a lot of writing by the colonists, and as I said, almost nothing by the Algonquin. So I've called this ethnographic encounters. That, don't get fooled by that long word ethnographic. It just means ethno is culture and graphic is writing. So writing about cultures, the encounters in colonial New England, and this, you know, we've reviewed this throughout the course, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it unless you have questions at the end. But brought English values and identity, the importance of the word, the importance of their religion, of course, but they also brought other key values which were at odds with how the Algonquin people that they encountered were living and understood their environment. And particularly important to their identity was the idea of private property that had been developing in Europe since the 16th century and the beginning of merchant capitalism. This idea that you could own land, and it was central to the identity of the colonists, owning land and by extension owning your own home. Still with us today, right? This sort of idea that that's part of what makes you, you know, a citizen. Settlements in permanent houses. They brought with them a certain way of farming, using iron tools, particularly plows and harnesses and some of the other implements that we've seen in some of the historical society in this course, and particularly the idea of cattle. Cattle were also possessions. They were private, they were important, and they should be allowed to roam their farms, and we saw this was a source of great trouble even during that peaceful period, to farm and live among their Algonquin neighbors. And a particularly pious form of Protestantism, and with an emphasis on literacy and the church. And we saw how towns, David explained to us how the towns were developed around the idea of getting a church and a town green and so on. So that was the basis of their idea of community and their idea of home. And they were creating a new home. They contrasted themselves, interestingly enough, initially, not to the Algonquins so much, who they were still trying to figure out, but to Spanish and Portuguese Catholics, who had also gone on voyages of discovery to the Americas, but to the South. And they were known for their cruel practices and their crass treatment of indigenous populations, much as they had treated Protestants and Jews and other people, of course, during the Inquisition. So they saw themselves as superior and enlightened, and they were here on a missionizing and peaceful, you know, coexistence project. That's at least how they sort of portrayed themselves in a lot of these writings. They took a paternalistic view. They thought maybe the indigenous people were slightly degenerate versions of themselves. They lived in a state of nature. That's why you see them portraying the Sachems, in the woods, with no civilized entrapments around them. They were free, and so on. They weren't tied down by private property and all these other things. They brought with them a governance hierarchy of elected and appointed leaders, mainly from England, but also elected here, that evolves into all kinds of different town government structures that we're familiar with in New England, like the town meeting, God help us. And they were based on documents that established claims. So they came with a patent, turns out to the wrong place, but they had the patent to establish a colony in the Hudson River Valley, bad weather, they got a delayed start, ended up in New England, but anyway, they eventually, figured out those documents so that it aligned with their settlement. And they traded, but they were there to trade to amass individual wealth. Okay, next slide. So, one further thing about this. They saw themselves as saviors. And we have some evidence, that we know that Philip and Wonsada decided to take Anglican names. That kind of surprised me. I don't know if it surprised you, but Lepore suggests, and unfortunately Strong Turtle isn't here to verify this, that Algonquin, people of these different Algonquin subtribes often would change their names as their life circumstances changed. So as you matured from being a child to, let's say, an adolescent, to, let's say, being able to marry and establish your own family, to becoming a warrior, to becoming an elder, might change your name. So they decided to take Anglican names, and they chose names Philip and Alexander, which were actually in reference to a piece of scripture that they must have known was important somehow to the British. This is the seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which has a Native American in the middle, and what's being uttered out of his mouth is, "Please come over and help us." Please come over and help us, which is a piece of scripture in which the Apostle Paul apparently has a vision of Macedonian Indians, Macedonian warriors, saying they needed to be saved, they needed to be converted to Christianity. So there's
Still part of the Massachusetts flag.
Right, so this is like a really dense, talk about key words, this is like a dense symbolism of how, Philip and Wamsata, his brother, were trying to sort of play off the English tropes and so on and say something meaningful to them. Next slide. So what about the Algonquin ethnographic piece? Now again, we don't have a lot of written records about them except from the perspective of the colonists, but where we get data or information about what their lives would have been like, some of it, as Strong Turtle was mentioning, is what we call in the anthropology field as salvage anthropology, where you're talking to elders of a group whose culture has basically been destroyed, and you're trying to help them through their memory resurrect what things were like in the old days. So you've got those kind of records, you have records from the point of contact, and then of course we have the archaeological record. And most really solid archaeologists, particularly these days, try to do very careful excavations and then use also historic accounts and interviews with contemporary members of those groups to try to understand what they're seeing that in the remains that are left behind. So we know, again, this is stuff we've covered. Carl, I think, did a good job of this in the second class. As this was a woodland culture based on subsistence agriculture, fishing, hunting, using stone tools. There were seasonal low-density settlements, and for different purposes, people would come together in larger groups. They moved in and out of settlements at the coast during the warm season when they were farming into the swamps with other kinds of settlements in the winter, and they stashed food for the season between the planting and harvest seasons. They were involved heavily in regional trade. They were also involved heavily in, as Strong Turtle was indicating, alliances with their neighbors. They had few possessions because they moved if you are a people who moves house a lot and you need to disperse quickly and set up somewhere else, why would you have a lot of stuff? It just makes no sense. There was no real concept of private property, although somebody could make something, they could have it, they could use it, it might be passed along, somebody else could ask for it in exchange for something else. Land and resources were for use value, not exchange value. So as long as you were using land, it was yours, but you didn't own it, you couldn't sell it, theoretically anyway, although we see that the sachems did make treaties and alienated land for wampum and guns and other things. But technically I don't think they knew that was permanent necessarily, at least at the beginning. There was a governing structure of inherited leadership positions, which the British misunderstood, thought were, royalty and so on, as well as spiritual leaders, powwows. These were fluid, people came in and out of those positions depending on their strengths. And one of the pieces here that's important is that leadership was really not just inherited, it was also by your talents as a leader. You had to be a good speaker, you had to be a good negotiator, you had to be a good diplomat to please a lot of people and to be able to hold alliances together. So people followed leaders who were persuasive. They couldn't necessarily be, as I understand it, commanded to do things. And decisions that were made by consensus or suggested and adopted out of leadership were not necessarily binding on the individuals in the group. So if you didn't like the decision, you could go live somewhere else. And why? Because identity was primarily based on both residence and kinship. And as we see, these groups were busy intermarrying all the time. So you always had allies in other places that you could move to as your life circumstances changed. So this was a very fluid kind of system that becomes more and more rigid, starting with the Great Death and starting with the influx of foreigners who now change the whole equation. Their cosmology or their religion, in contrast to Puritan Protestantism, included spirits and ancestors, heavy influence of the idea of prophecy, rites of passage, so rituals that mark different phases of the life cycle. And finally, this is really important, it's an area that interests me greatly, not just among Algonquin cultures, but in Africa, where I've done most of my research, and the South Pacific. They were not necessarily literate until contact, and some of them were converted, but they communicated. Okay, they communicate in a variety of different ways, via ritual, performance, which would be dance, drumming, music, even by beadwork. I want to just make it aside here that the beadwork and craftsmanship of women in almost every group I've ever encountered has been underestimated as a form of communication. And I don't know more about it. It's something to follow up if you're interested. But dress, hairstyles, and so on. These were forms of communication that the Europeans did not understand, but they all had a common vocabulary that was not just oral tradition. Next. Okay, how am I doing on time? Okay. Purity and Danger. This is the name of the author, Mary Douglas, who wrote a very influential book that is kind of the framework in the 1970s. Great book, little book if you want to read it, written for a popular as well as specialist audience. It forms kind of an anthropological framework that Lepore is using to understand what was happening in the interaction between these two very, very different cultural groups. And the idea is very pretty simple actually. Humans are animals, all animals we know are social, they communicate and so on. It's only humans that have both words and complex symbols because of our very complicated brain circuitry. It's something that we evolved, that gave us an evolutionary advantage way back, began to evolve 5 million years ago. Symbols are basically things that stand for something else. If I use a set of sounds that comes out of the English word bottle, you all understand that this means this thing. There's nothing inherent in those sounds that means this thing. It's arbitrary. All language is arbitrary. So all symbols, therefore, are arbitrary. They're based on an agreement that a group of people have. This stands for this. So we create very elaborate systems of meaning that are basically the building blocks of the cultures that we live in. And those systems have categories and rules that sort things into different categories. So we can distinguish up from down, left from right, black from white, and so on, hot from cold. And the ideal template of a culture is actually the human body, and that's, we could talk about this if we had time. Some of the communication through bodies in the course of a war speaks volumes that are not in the written records. People, things, behaviors, and so on that are within, we're now talking about a particular society, so just imagine a society, a group of people living together. Things that are within the category are safe, they're proper, they're sorted into the right box. So we know what left means, we know death as opposed to life and so on, we know day as opposed to night. So things that are within those categories are safe, they're proper, and eventually they are also seen as pure or authentic. Things, behaviors, people that are outside of those categories, so they don't fit into any of the symbolic categories we've created to understand the world we live in, those things are dangerous, and they're bad, and they're potentially even polluting. Mary Douglas taught actually at NYU when I was doing a degree there, and she used to say in explanation that the things that we consider dirt are just matter out of place. Dirt is just matter out of place. So gravel in your driveway, nicely raked, up to your door, welcomes people, it drains off the water as they get out of their car and come to your threshold. And it's perfectly fine, there's nothing wrong with that gravel. The minute that you don't wipe your feet well enough and you drag it across the threshold and it's on the floor, then it becomes dirt. So it's the same thing, the gravel hasn't changed, it's just in the wrong place, right? And it's one of the reasons that a house is also a great template of a culture because it has doorways, it has boundaries, it may even have fences and yards, and doorways and thresholds become really important. It's one of the reasons that they often left spiked heads at crossroads and so on, because they signify boundaries. So people, and then by extension, people, things, and behaviors that fall between categories or that threaten the boundaries of something are potentially dangerous and threatening. This framework is very useful if you think about why people are so threatened, for example, by the idea of same-sex marriage. Nobody's telling you you have to marry somebody of the same sex, but why should it be threatening if somebody else wants to marry somebody of the same sex, for gosh sakes? Why do we find this use of, why is there so much brouhaha about pronoun use these days? You know, they're saying they instead of him or her, you know, as a defined gender. It's because it's interstitial, it's something ambiguous and in between. So things that cross boundaries are also problematic. Okay, that's the framework. The British understood that to be human meant to live in settled villages with proper houses, boundaries, fences, so on, and a set of order, right? And the green, the church. Okay, and for them, the indigenous people were not civilized and were disorderly because we couldn't find where their houses were. And their houses moved, they weren't even permanent. And after all, they weren't living out in the open, they were living in a swamp some of the time. What's that, right? So that's not cleared land, that's not cleared fields as they understood it. Colonists and indigenous Algonquins had very different rules about warfare. What was supposed to happen during war, and as you heard Strong Turtle talk about it, there were skirmishes, there were wars, people were taken captive, and blood was spilled between these different Algonquin tribes prior to colonial contact, and it accelerated after the Great Dying. Why? Because many Algonquins went to war with neighbors to increase or replenish their population when people died. So we had the Great Dying, we had these epidemics, and all of a sudden they needed more people. And so they would raid their neighbors, they would take captives and so on. They would negotiate land.
You don't want to kill them.
Okay, yeah. Right. But they rarely, I mean, they didn't seem to have a concept of the idea of exterminating their enemies, if you know what I mean. And it's not that they didn't, they often didn't destroy property in quite the same way, and they also have very strict rules about attacking civilians and women and children, particularly, who were in hiding. And they also never used rape as a war weapon. Next slide.
That's why Mary Rawlinson was safe.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, so near and far. We're talking about the differences between these groups, but one of the key insights I took away from reading Lepore was that for the British, it wasn't so much the scariness of the difference of their Algonquin neighbors that was a problem. They themselves were worried about becoming Indians. That they were exposed, they were away from their British, everything they knew about civilized culture, and now they were in this strange land and they were being exposed to the pagan ideas and to different ways of doing things. And after all, even at the beginning, when they couldn't build permanent houses, they were building themselves little temporary shelters like wigwams. And so they had this certain amount of anxiety about the nearness, not the farness, but the nearness of the people they were living with. And this is a reason why converted, praying Indians, Algonquin translators and advisors, the best example here is John Sossamon here, become dangerous, potentially polluting, and difficult. They are people who cross boundaries, right? They were Indian, they learned English, They learned to read and write. They were fluent in both cultures. They were advising leaders of communities that couldn't speak to each other and therefore maybe were lying, maybe, as was suspected of John Sossaman, cutting themselves a little bit of a profit when the treaties were signed and so on. So she argues actually the death of John Sossaman was almost predestined because he was literate, literally because he was literate. The other problematic category of actors in King Philip's War, from the perspective of particularly, well, I think probably both Algonquins and colonists, were captives, people who were captured, like Mary Rawlinson, John Printer, Joshua Teft, who met different fates. Had they gone rogue? Did they degenerate, become Indian during captivity? Did they lose all their Englishness? Or were they sincere and repentant victims who wanted to be freed and wanted to return to civilization? This is all part of the captivity narrative, and Rawlinson does a brilliant job, apparently. Her book became a bestseller, and she was welcomed back into the community by her husband and so on, because she confessed that she had failed in her mission to face death before being taken captive. But she used that time to reflect and to repent in good, pious, Puritan style, and so she becomes, an example. The fate of the praying Indians on Deer Isle, as we saw, ends with them ending up in slavery and or internal bondage. Why? Because towards the end of the war, even as Strong Turtle was suggesting to us, so many Algonquins were coming forward and trying to get amnesty and to be protected, and they were surrendering. And then you had these people, kind of like the Japanese internment camps in World War II, where they just rounded them up because maybe they were an internal threat. And after all, we know that the praying Indians still had relatives who were not praying Indians. They were among the troops that were fighting the colonists. So who did they really owe their alliances to in the end? They couldn't be trusted. They might join further rebellions, and so the idea was, the ideal solution was to ship them out, get rid of them, and make a profit doing it. Now the colonists did not all agree on that, and particularly writers like John Eliot, and up to the end almost Roger Williams protested that this was a really terrible way to go. So it wasn't like there was uniform agreement about that policy. We get the next slide. We're almost done here. War without end. The war didn't end. We know that Philip was shot on August 12th, and then Church ordered that his body be desecrated, so he was drawn into fours. His body was mutilated, hung from trees. He was beheaded. Head was put on a spike. Was carried around for a while for a Thanksgiving Day parade back at home, and then it basically stood as a monument to the victory of the colonists for another decade or so. Were any final words spoken? Because he was shot, by surprise. There was no treaty. There was never a lasting peace, and those Algonquin who were scattered, and many of them took refuge among the Abenaki, continued to attack, periodically attack colonial settlements, throughout the next 100 years or so. There was some cultural assimilation where it was possible, even though indigenous servants, house servants, as we saw in Bristol last week, weren't assimilated really. They were second-class citizens, but there was a maintenance of craft and other traditions, which I guess if we'd had longer with Strong Turtle, he might have talked about. And the languages did, unfortunately, pretty much.
That was a survival technique for women after the war, to make baskets.
And make baskets.
Would live on the edges of towns.
Right, and sell them for trinkets and things of that sort. And then in the 1970s, under the American Indian movement, there was an attempt to reestablish sovereignty. And I haven't had time to talk about it, but it is key in Lepore's argument that the British knew, there's evidence in their documents, that they understood that they were trying to have their cake and eat it too. because under the rules of war, they, by trying to have treaties with these different Algonquin subtribes, the Narragansett, the Packanaut, the so on and so on, they were acknowledging that they were sovereign people because they were entering into a contract with them to get land and to negotiate the terms of settlement and all of these things, right? So were they a sovereign people? If they were a sovereign people, then the international rules of law, and she said this is very key to some of the writing that you see during the war, the international rules of law that were established in Amsterdam, and still reside in The Hague, by the way, who are trying to determine whether the war in Gaza is a genocide or not, right? So the rules of war included the fact that you were not allowed to wantonly destroy property, that you weren't allowed to attack civilians, that, mutilation, getting of war trophies and so on. And by the way, both colonists and the Algonquin, as we know, took war trophies. They took heads, they took scalps, they desecrated bodies and so on, for different reasons. They had really different reasons. I could answer a question about that, but I don't want to get off on a tangent. So anyway, there were attempts to reestablish the idea of sovereignty, and some groups were successful at it, and some not. For reasons we talked about, the Packanaut have not yet established themselves as a nation, and attempts to, as much as possible, revive their languages.
That's still going on.
And that is still going on. That is ongoing. Just two more quick slides. One is that, among the documents that Lepore talks about are the popular understandings of King Philip's War, not just at the time, because accounts of it continue to be published for the next, decade or so, but even, much later on in the 1800s, now we have King Philip's War being resurrected again, really in service of the idea of the threat of Indians and the idea of frontier and the notion that Indians have to be removed to their own territories. And out of this comes a play that I guess was incredibly popular called Metamora, The Curse of Metamora. And it's performed in a lot of venues all around New England and even in the South. It's very dramatic. Metacom dies in it, and actually the audience cheers on his behalf because he actually utters a curse against white people forevermore and generations and so on and so forth. But the key to it is this idea that he's the last of the Wampanoag, which I knew growing up as a sort of popular series on TV, The Last of the Mohegans, right? And James Fenimore Cooper writes the Leatherstocking Tales and so on and so forth. So this sort of, dual image of a threat, but also, a fierce, proud people living in a state of nature, and so on and so forth, and the last of their kind, and they're somehow noble savages. They're savages, but they're noble savages. But they're the last of their kind, and whatever is left has to be shipped off to make way for new settlements. Last slide. And she says, well, there's two more slides. So this is a picture of the last of the Wampanoags, and here's, Metamora, or Metacom, offering his curse. And he's surrounded by waterfalls and rocks and, nature and
This
so
was
on.
performed in Warren in 1914.
1914, this is still being performed, so you can imagine. And then this is a slide by the author herself, in current Bristol, Rhode Island. So, the war is not finished, and it's not present except the names, the streets, the places. British established, the colonial settlers established their memorials, their places of loss, their places of victory, and as we see, there's a hidden landscape that is now also being resurrected by people like David and obviously Algonquin actors who are interested in reviving and reconstructing the history of the war. So that's kind of her argument in a nutshell. I really recommend this. It's a very readable book. I hope I've done it justice, but it is dense, so it will take you a little bit of time to get through it because her, I think, but definitely worth it, and in a way I think sort of underpins the whole structure and the point of this terrific course. And so thank you for recommending it, David.
Thank you for presenting.